Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 6, Section 2, Developmental History of Yixing Mining, Part 2, Modern Mining. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny.
What's up?
And Zongzun Li.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Pat. Hello, Zongzun. My first question, what prevented Yixing mining from industrializing before the communist era?
Well, the first one is definitely the technology difficulties as pre-communist, and even so in ROC period, industrialization has been constantly interrupted by a lot of historical events for various reasons. I'm sure we can go into details in the following discussion. But technology difficulty is definitely the first challenge. Any kind of industrialization activities in China pre-communist.
And sorry, I was going to just add, you go on to write as well that the availability of cheap human labor also prevented any kind of need for industrialization as well.
I think that there was likely a labor trap, that the overabundance of affordable to cheap labor certainly prevented the natural industrialization. But Zongzun touches on the idea of technological limitations. Is that because Western powers wouldn't trade with China, or because China didn't have a local industrial base? What was it, and was it unique to Yixing that prevented its industrialization in that time period?
Industrialization pre-communist was a pretty cumbersome path. You have the early Yangwu Yundong proposed by the Qing government to try to mimic the Meiji Revolution in Japan. But that didn't really go anywhere due to various reasons. One of the major one being massive corruption within the government. And then you have the partially successful industrialization by the early ROC for the period that people frequently call the golden 10 years before the Japanese invasion. And then that totally interrupt the entire industrialization and modernization of China. And then, it was only until actually after 1950 that China is once again united under the Communist Party. And then people start to have the chance, the time, and the availability to start to industrialize again. And also at the time, it was with a lot of help by the Soviet Union. But it wasn't really until the 50s that industrialization started to happen in multiple industries within China.
How is this related to the larger question of China's lack of industrialization during the late dynastic period? Is it unique to Yixing, or was this true across the board?
I think it's true across the board. Cheap labor is one of the major reasons. And also, I think pretty significant reason is the control of the government. That actually happened in a lot of other societies too. Like the question, once you free up all the labors by using machine, how are you going to use all the excess labors? What are you going to allocate them to? This is an especially significant question for the Qing government because it was a minority ethnicity controlling the major population. Social stability is of their utmost concern at all time for any social development.
I think another interesting point that was probably preventing a lot of development and industrialization is just how large, right, the Chinese domestic economy was. So if you think about it, for many other smaller countries, often you don't have all the natural resources that you are going to need, right? And you have to find ways to work with other countries around your borders to trade, and having some kind of leverage, usually in a military fashion, if not economic, helps to make sure that those trades go positively for your side. And so usually that leads to some kind of developments, whether that's industrialization, mechanization, but often war and financial trade gain leads many times to industrialization and development. China, having many of the natural resources they needed just within their own border, didn't really need to go down that path, or at least we didn't see them doing that too much in the late Qing into the ROC. In fact, often the trade was negatively disadvantaging them when their borders were open.
Yeah, like the two Opium War.
Yeah.
That covers the dynastic period. But what changes in the communist era that allows or forces Yixing to industrialize? It's not as if China's population fell. It's not as if trade became more balanced in the communist era, right? It actually probably became less balanced again. So what changes? Why does Yixing suddenly begin to industrialize? And in what way does it industrialize in the communist era?
I think that the government decides, right, that the collectivization and industrialization is part of the image that they want to have associated with their government. And so they become an industrial communist economy versus just a communist economy.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And also a lot of the historical mines are being deprived by years and years of minings. And finding new mines and increase the scale of mining start to gain importance within the Yixing industry. So industrialization can definitely increase yield. And it's also, as Pat said, a refreshed image of what Yixing will be in the communist era in their mind.
But so to Pat's point, it was a government decision to industrialize. This was part of the Maoist philosophy, the Maoist government ideology that Yixing should be industrialized.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. At the time, there's no private ownership of any activities. Anything happens on a society scale is proposed by the government at the time, at least.
So that opens up a number of questions, right? First, it opens up the question, why Yixing? Wasn't there other more lucrative things that they could be industrializing? Were other things similarly industrialized? The second question is, what did the makers of Yixing think of this industrialization? What happened with the miners? What happened with the ceramic artists, right? Was this something that the population was in favor of, or was this something that was forced top down by the government?
I think the first reason is that Yixing doesn't only yield zisha; it also produces a lot of other associated clays like jiani, baini for daily ceramics. So, increasing in life quality and so on and so forth definitely led to a increased demand of all the daily usage wares. And that's one of the major reasons the industrialization of Yixing mining is to produce more jiani at the early days. On the other hand, Yixing being a major exportation wares is a constant and great supply of foreign currency for exportation. So that's why the government at the time invests greatly in exporting higher quality zisha wares to multiple countries.
I think adding on to Zongzun's point, mining in Yixing didn't just yield zisha and jiani, but assuming it also yielded metals, I think industrialization probably happened in other metal mining areas. I'm sure it happened within the agricultural sphere as well, but to what degree, I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Many industries, industrialization was happening. It was happening at a pace so fast that led to the great leap forward. In
super successful
days, which very interesting path.
Jason, I know there was a second and a third part to that question. I don't think we got to.
The second part of the question was the sociology of it. Were the local peoples working in the mining and artistic ceramics industries, were they in favor of this industrialization?
I guess it depends, particularly for the people in more of the mining side, on how much easier or not easier it made their life. I think, if you were getting paid based on an output basis, then I'm sure you would be in favor of industrialization, but I assume that was not the labor model that was going on at the time.
I don't believe so in the collectivization. It's likely that it was done in the communist style.
I guess it depends on how much into the state you believe that you want to contribute. So I guess if industrialization is helping you contribute more to the state and you believe in the state, then probably to some degree you're in favor of industrialization. Now for the artists, I don't know. It really depends on their ideology as an artist, right? If working with hand mined and meticulously processed clays is something of importance to them, then maybe industrialization was viewed negatively, but it's possible, and I'm sure that you're going to go on to talk more about this, but it's possible that industrialization increased the quality of the clays that the artists had to work with. And in that case, I would think that it would be a positive thing for them.
The opinions seem to be unclear. It seems that it was more ideologically driven than and driven by personal beliefs than by any kind of large scale thinking about the Yixing and the future of Yixing wares. I have not found any evidence one way or another, but you can see writings from some of the top Yixing masters that veer very carefully one way or another.
At the time, the founding of F1 and also the early masters leading the production groups, they were not allowed to implement any new design other than all the pre-designed templates. They're not allowed to contribute their own personal work into all the wares that they build. It's all built by everybody, by the people. There's only the factory stamp. There's no personal stamp. So I'm not sure of exactly what they're thinking in their head, but in terms of artistic ownership of their own creation, I think that definitely didn't exist at that era.
That was mostly true during the Cultural Revolution period, but the times directly preceding and following the Cultural Revolution period, more freedom in artistic expression for traditional art, particularly for Yixing, was allowed.
Oh yeah. Anything after mid-70s are a totally different route.
Other than the Cultural Revolution, how likely to express an opinion, that could have been posed to the ideology of collectivization, how likely would that have even been expressed by an artist?
Yeah, well, I would say pretty unlikely. And it really doesn't matter at the time. Persecution happening not from top down, but also within the same hierarchy. It's all about, 站队. I don't even know how to translate that in English, but, like grouping yourself in the right party.
Do you fall enough along party lines? Are you a strong, image for the party?
Or in the right group? This time you're in the right group, but next time, who knows? The group themselves can be self-divided. It was a crazy time. And at the time, for artists, the best survival tactic is, just shut up, not saying anything or express anything.
Make glory to Mao Zedong, Teapots. I mean, we certainly have records from some, right? Jiang Rong spoke pretty harshly about the excess of the Cultural Revolution period and her treatment in the factory during that period.
Yeah, and a lot of sad things happened to artists and scientists and the scholar communities at the time.
Between the late 1930s and the early 1960s, there was an almost 10x increase in the extraction of Yixing ore. What technological changes enabled such a massive increase in production?
Well, on the later end of that period, I'm sure more towards the 60s, some degree of electrifying mines probably helped as far as being able to actually see what you were doing in the mines. Earlier on, you write that there was a shift from manual excavation and extraction to industrialized. So I'm assuming some kind of technology comes into play that's allowing one individual to mine a far greater output than they were prior to this industrialization. I don't know if that's like blast mining or what that looks like.
Yeah, dynamite.
Dynamite.
Yeah. Boom, boom. And also the technology was able to allow the miners at the time to expand existing mines and also start to construct new shafts along the mines to increase yield.
The new shafts played a major role. If you think you're going from tiny tunnels that barely crawl spaces, because anything that you mined out, right, had to be carried out. And so, you can barely turn around, you could not stand up. These mines, the original mines, were very small, very dangerous work in. The new mines were head high. You could stand. They installed rails. They blasted it with dynamite. It had modern scaffolding, so it was less prone to collapse. So the overall technological advantages were numerous. And then you think about what they did to make not just increase production, but to increase production by making life easier for the laborer. So first putting in electric lighting, then putting in rail and motorized transport. Motorized transport developed relatively rapidly. In the 1960s, it was still coil hoist people using a little ratchet system to raise and lower mine cars on rails. And then afterwards, it becomes motorized. Not electric, right? But you're running a diesel motor or something that can bring the rail cars up and down. So 10xing production, but you did not 10x human labor. Actually, human labor seems likely to have fallen on a per mine basis, spread out across a greater number of mines. Why did Yixing mining and production begin to decline in the 1980s?
Talked about this a little bit in the last discussion. I think we all gave our prediction, but plastic, the introduction of cheap plastics, took a toll really on what people needed. Things like Johnny and Nunny for when it comes to everyday wares. Now you could just buy, a plastic plate or a plastic flower pot.
And there was a short felt out of flavor of traditional luxury goods at the early age of reform and open up era. I still remember at the time people would throw away like old wood furnitures in exchange of Western chrome glazed steel chairs or tables, only to find out that, you know, those furnitures can later on buy probably cartloads of those steel tables and chairs in the early 2000s.
I feel like we need that meme from The Graduate. One word: plastics. Just want to say one word to you. Yes, one word: plastics. Sorry, back to you, Pat.
No, I think we covered it. So we know that definitely plastic had a large impact on the demand for Yixing materials, mostly I think due to the daily use wares.
Plastics made it less affordable to mine zisha because there was less demand for jiani.
Right, correct.
And Zongzun, to your point, overall demand for traditional Chinese wares was declining at that time, even if they were to rebound later.
That's right.
How did privatization and eventual environmental regulation affect Yixing production in the 1990s?
Well, the private mines and privatization of production of Yixing in the late 90s and early 2000s were pretty intense. Larger scales of production and mining technology were implemented, and it was definitely not strictly following the guidelines or the policy at the time. So by, I think, the mid-early 2000s, the local government and the national government start to implement new policy to regulate mining activities in Yixing to protect the environment. Finally, in 2010, 2011, the government start to publish this new policy to cease all production of Yixing, of zisha in Yixing.
And where does that leave us today? What ore do we have that's mined or that's stockpiled or that's available?
We've got tons. So, you know, it's really strange where we're going with this, right? Is that many vendors, I have pretty heavily pervaded the myth that Yixing is no longer being mined. And so Yixing and zisha ore is something that is rare, but so much was mined, you know, in the period that we really just discussed, right? Thinking about like the 30s through the early 2000s. I mean, so much ore was mined. This is a material that needs to rest after it's mined before being processed and used. That stockpiles are quite large. There's no risk of us running out of material to make Yixing teapots anytime in the near future. And it's interesting, you know, the date that Zongzun cited, 2010, when the moratorium on mining was established, instituted. That's like when I just started to get into tea. And this was already something that I was hearing, you know, from vendors was like, oh, you know, Yixing, you're no longer able to mine. Teapots are going to be so rare. I was already hearing that by 2010. It's really funny to look back on it now, you know, 13 years later and see, no, you know, there's no short supply of new teapots every year from every sort of vendor under the sun.
Artists, even individual artists within Yixing are owning, you know, stockpiles of zisha clays anywhere from 1 or 2 tons to sometimes tens to the hundreds of tons. And all of them are needed to be rested and aged before usage. So we still have a pretty long runway to go before everything runs out.
I think there'll be a lot more pressing issues other than Yixing shortages by the time we would even be thinking about Yixing material running out.
True. Rising sea level, there will be no Yixing.
the existence of tea still, who knows, right?
Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, specific Yixing zisha mines by region.